She crossed my threshold on a gray morning in the last week of autumn, and the war followed her in with the cold. I had been told what she was. My steward, Corvin, had read the letter 3 times before he brought it to me, the way he does when he is deciding how much of his own dread to leave out. A shame gift, the Dravenmere wording ran. That was not the formal phrasing, but it was the shape of the thing. Myra Ashe, soldier's daughter, third-ranked among Dravenmere's border captains before the last border skirmish cost them the ridge and 200 wolves. Her king's way of saying, "Here is something of ours we no longer need. Display her or discard her as suits you. Either way, we have reminded your court that you hold our people at your pleasure." A stone thrown through a window dressed in silk. My council expected me to send her back within the hour, which would have been the reply her king wanted, proof I found the gesture beneath me. Or keep her and parade her in the lower seats at feast, which would have been the other reply, proof I could be petty when I chose. I had sat with the letter for an hour and decided to do neither, mostly because I have always disliked giving anyone the answer they anticipated. She came in through the south gate with a single pack horse and 2 Dravenmere border guards who looked as though they expected to be detained. My court had turned out to watch, not a formal receiving line, but the quiet, deliberate arrangement of people who want to witness something and pretend they were simply passing. The great hall of Aravast Keep has sandstone walls that go amber in morning light and iron gates at the south end that stand open in peacetime and half open in times like these. And that morning, the courtyard between the gates and the hall was full of still wolves and still people, and a silence that had its own particular texture. I stood at the top of the hall steps. My wolf, Wren, stood at my left. She walked in through the half-open gate without hesitating, which I noted. The 2 guards fell back at the gate. Their orders, presumably, were to deliver her and withdraw. She came the rest of the way alone, across 30 yards of courtyard stone with 2 courts watching her, and she walked the way someone walks when they have decided in advance that they will not show anything that can be used. Soldier's daughter, that part was accurate. She stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up at me with gray eyes that were measuring rather than afraid, and she said, quite levelly, "I am Myra Ashe of Dravenmere. I understand you've been expecting me." The dryness in her voice was slight, not quite defiance, something more careful than that, an acknowledgement that she understood the situation and had already made her accounting of it and found it manageable. I had opened my mouth to answer when Wren moved. Wren has been my wolf for 14 years. He has stood at ceremonies, wars, treaty signings, and the deaths of 3 of my council members without doing anything but remaining at my side. He has never, in 14 years, done anything at a formal occasion that I did not expect. He walked down the hall steps, past me, across 6 feet of courtyard stone, and lay down at the feet of Myra Ashe of Dravenmere. Not a sit, not a pause, a full, deliberate lie-down, his great head between his paws, his eyes half closed, the posture he uses in his own den when he has decided the day is over, and he is entirely at ease. The courtyard went so quiet I could hear the lanterns. Myra looked down at him. She looked down at him for a long moment, and then she looked up at me with an expression I would spend the next 6 weeks trying to correctly identify. It was not triumph. It was not smugness. It was closer to the look of someone who has stepped into a room they did not expect to enter and is quietly deciding what to do with the fact that they are now inside it. She said, "That is not what I was told to expect." "No," I said, "it is not what I was expecting either." I had her shown to the south guest rooms and told Corvin she was not a prisoner and not a trophy, and the next person who used the phrase shame gift in my hearing would spend a week reviewing the granary records. Then I went back into my study and sat down and looked at my hands for a while. Wren had followed her to the guest rooms. He was sitting outside her door when I sent to check. My counsel had opinions. I have a good counsel, 4 people who between them have more collected years of governing Aravas than I have been alive, which is occasionally useful and occasionally the source of a particular kind of slow, steady resistance that feels like being politely walked into a wall. Corvin is the most efficient. Sella, my archivist general, is the most measured. The twins Roth and Edwin govern the eastern and western reaches, and arrive at court for formal occasions with matching expressions that mean they have already discussed the matter between themselves and reached a consensus before anyone else had a chance to object. Their consensus that morning was variations on the same theme. She should be returned. The wolf lying down was an anomaly. Keeping her gave Dravenmir's king the appearance of having successfully placed a spy in my court. The optics, Roth's word, which I find a bloodless way to discuss something that is actually about dignity, were poor. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "She stays as a diplomatic guest. She is not under guard, she is not under restriction, and she is not to be referred to as anything other than her name and her rank." Edwin said carefully, "Your wolf lying down at her feet." "Yes." A pause. "You understand what people will say." "I know what it means," I said. "I am not ready to say it aloud." "That does not mean it isn't true." They left with the expressions of people who have been given an answer they do not know how to argue against and have decided to let the situation develop before pressing further. I have found, in 11 years of ruling Aravast, that this is sometimes the only kind of win available. She did not behave like someone who expected to be useful as a spy. This is the thing I noticed first, in the days after her arrival. A spy behaves carefully, they find the right rooms to be in, ask the questions that seem artless, make themselves agreeable in the specific ways that open doors. Myra Ashe behaved like someone who had been given a room in a house she had not chosen and was figuring out what to do with the time. She walked the courtyards in the morning early, before most of the keep was awake. I know this because Wren started disappearing before dawn, and I followed him twice before I understood where he was going. She used the archive rooms in the afternoon, not pulling records but reading history, Aravast history, specifically, which is not the behavior of someone gathering intelligence so much as someone trying to understand the place they've landed. On the 5th day, she asked Sella if she could access the old border maps. Sella came to me with this as though it were an alarm. I said, "Let her," Sella said. "The border maps include the ridge." I said, "I know." "Let her." On the 6th day, I walked into the archive room at the hour I usually used it, and found Myra Ashe at the long map table with the ridge survey spread in front of her, and a look on her face that was not the look of a strategist. It was the look of someone reading a record of a place where something went wrong and trying to understand exactly how. I said, "Were you at the ridge?" She looked up. 3 days before it fell, I was reassigned north before the skirmish. She paused. 200 wolves. 211, I said. We lost 43. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know that. We were told," she stopped. "We were told your losses were minimal. We were told yours were chosen. Volunteers for the offensive." She looked at me. They were not volunteers. We stood on opposite sides of the map table for a moment, and I thought about 211 wolves from Dravenmir and 43 from Aravast, and the 11 years of Cold War that made those numbers possible, and how strange it was to be standing in my own archive room having this conversation with a woman my enemy's king had sent me as an insult. I said, "What do you actually know about the Ridge decision?" She said, "Enough, probably more than I should." I pulled a chair out across the table from her and sat down. "Tell me." We were there until the evening lanterns came on. Wren slept outside her door every night. I knew this the way I always know what Wren is doing, not through the bond precisely, more the way you know where a fire is burning in your own house, a warmth at an unusual angle. He was not distressed and he was not guarding. He was simply there, the way he is in his den when he has decided something is worth staying near. I noticed in the second week that something else had changed. There was a warmth at my left wrist that had not been there before. Not pain, nothing so dramatic. A low warmth, the kind that lives in healed bone on a cold morning, present and steady. I had worn the mate mark sight since I was 20, the old place on the inner left wrist where a faded bond announces itself, when it announces itself, which mine never had. I had reached 32 without it waking. My counsel had mentioned the succession. I had told them I was aware. The warmth at my wrist was not, I told myself, related to the woman currently reading my ridge records with the focused quiet of someone who wanted to understand something true. I told myself this with some frequency over the following 2 weeks. On the evening of the 16th day, I came into the courtyard at dusk and found Myra sitting on the low wall near the lantern post, watching one of my border wolves sleep in a sunbeam it had been following across the stones all afternoon. The wolf, old Kale, who has 7 years on Wren and a leg that twinges in cold weather, and has not warmed up to a new person since my archivist's cat scratched him in the autumn of my first year as Alpha, had his head in her lap. I stopped. She looked up and had the grace not to look like she'd been caught at something. "He followed me from the East Passage," she said. "I didn't invite him. He doesn't follow people. He hasn't followed anyone since, I considered. Since my father's Luna, who has been gone for 9 years. Myra looked down at Kale. Kale's tail moved once, slowly, in the particular way of very old wolves who have decided not to waste effort on enthusiasm, but mean it nonetheless. She said quietly, "I'm not doing anything." "I know," I said. "That's the part that keeps requiring me to reconsider my assumptions." She looked up at me then, and there was something in the gray of her eyes that I was beginning to know, the look she gets when she is deciding whether something is worth saying. She said, "Why did you keep me here? And please don't say diplomatic guest. I know what I was sent as." I sat down on the wall on the other side of Kale. He did not object. "Because Wren lay down at your feet," I said. "And because I have 11 years of a war I didn't start and 43 dead wolves, and you walked in with a look in your eyes like someone who was willing to be honest about a bad situation, and I find I have become very tired of people who are not." She was quiet. Then, "That is a more honest answer than I expected. You asked an honest question." Kale made a sound of deep contentment. The lantern above us came on. The keep lights itself at dusk in the older sections, a working of the old packs that I have never managed to make the architects explain properly. In the warm yellow light, with the old wolf between us and the courtyard quiet and the smell of late autumn on the air, I felt the warmth at my wrist intensify by several degrees. I looked at it, because I was done pretending I wasn't. She noticed me looking and looked at her own wrist, the same inner left wrist, the same sight. Neither of us said anything for a moment. She said carefully, "Does that mean what I think it means?" "Yes," I said. "In Dravenmere," she said, "the mate mark is it's considered." She stopped, tried again. "My king sent me here to shame you. A soldier's daughter, no rank, from the pack that lost the ridge. He thought you'd send me back or display me." I know what he thought. "If this is real," she said very quietly, "then he sent me to my fated mate by accident." "That," I said, "is very likely the most elegant irony I have encountered in 11 years of ruling." A long pause. Kale's breathing had deepened into sleep between us. She said, "I want you to know I have no intention of using this." I looked at her, using it. As leverage, or as a claim, or I don't know what the custom is in Aravost, but in Dravenmere the mate bond carries rights and I am not. She pressed her lips together. "I am not interested in arriving at anything I haven't chosen clearly." Something in my chest, which had been maintaining a carefully managed composure for the better part of 16 days, went very still. I said, "In Aravost the mate bond can be declined." Can it? By either party. It has happened twice in the recorded history of this kingdom. Both times, the wolves in the surrounding territory mourned for a week and then recovered. I paused. I am told it requires a certain act of will and causes some discomfort. And if it isn't declined? Then the midwinter rite, when both parties choose it consciously before witnesses, confirms it. The mark fully surfaces. The bond becomes permanent. She looked at the warmth moving at her wrist, then up at me. That's in 6 weeks, she said. Yes. A great deal could happen in 6 weeks. It could, I agreed. She looked at Cale. Then, with some deliberateness, she moved one hand, the left one, and rested it beside mine on the wall, near enough that I was aware of the warmth between them without our touching. Then let's not decide tonight, she said. No, I said, let's not. We sat there until the cold drove us in, and the warmth at my wrist settled into something I would call quiet certainty, though I told it, in my own mind, to hold. The following 5 weeks were the strangest of my adult life, and I have governed a wolf kingdom through a cold war and 2 succession challenges, and a drought that lasted 3 summers, so that is not a small claim. She was not what I had expected a Dravenmere soldier's daughter to be. I had known Dravenmere's warriors. I had met them across borders and at the 2 brief ceasefires in the last 11 years, and they are a certain kind of person, capable, hard-angled, designed for a landscape that is cold and does not apologize for it. Myra had all of that and something else underneath it, the way certain blades have been folded so many times that the surface shows a pattern the eye keeps trying to follow. She was precise, not cold precise. She said exactly what she meant, which after 11 years of counsels and diplomats was something I found I had been missing without knowing. She had a dry humor that surfaced in small, quiet moments and then vanished again before you were quite sure it had been there. She was methodical. She finished the Aravost history records and asked Sella for the economic archives from the pre-war decades, and when Sella came to me the 3rd time about it, I told her that Myra Ashe was allowed to read whatever she found useful, and that if she managed to produce a clearer analysis of the trade situation than my own economists had, I would be delighted. She did, in fact, produce a cleaner analysis. She left it on the map table in the archive room without comment, as though it had always been there, and Corvin found it and brought it to me with an expression of someone who has revised a position significantly and is experiencing some discomfort about having been wrong. I found her on the 22nd day in the East Courtyard in the late afternoon, teaching one of the younger pack wolves, a half-grown thing, Roth's youngest ward wolf, Bryn, who has the energy of a controlled explosion and the judgment of a river stone, how to track by scent across wind. She wasn't hunting with him. She was showing him carefully how the wind changed the scent's arrival, and he was sitting with his whole body focused forward the way young wolves do when something finally makes sense to them. I watched from the arch for several minutes before she noticed me. She said he was trying to track Wren and kept overshooting. Dravenmere method, we use crosswind approach. I know the method, I said. I didn't know you taught it. She tilted her head. I learned it from my father. He said it was actually an old Aravost technique that Dravenmere adopted before the war. He was right. It was developed by my grandfather's packmaster. I paused. My wolves stopped using it after the war because they didn't want to be seen teaching Dravenmere methods. Myra looked at Bryn, who had taken advantage of the pause to practice on his own, and was now sitting with his nose tilted at exactly the angle she had shown him. 40 years of wolves learning an inferior method, she said, because the good one came from the wrong place. Yes, I said. Welcome to 11 years of Cold War. She met my eyes, and the warmth at my wrist was so strong in that moment that I stopped pretending to myself that I was undecided about what I intended to do at the midwinter rite. My council had further opinions at the 4-week mark. Roth and Edwin had pivoted, Edwin fastest, wroth with the slightly pained look of someone who dislikes revising, but both of them, with the trade analysis and the border maps, and the weight of 6 weeks in the same keep with someone who was not what the framing had suggested. The opposition that remained was more careful. Corvin, who has never been opposed to Myra as a person, but is temperamentally cautious about anything that arrives as a surprise. And in the official capacity of border concerns, a message from 3 of the outlying pack holds whose alphas had opinions about the Dravenmere connection. I dealt with the pack hold letters by inviting 2 of the 3 alpha heads to court for the midwinter rite, and writing the third a personal letter that I have found, over the years, to be the most effective option for people who will dig in if addressed as a group, but will consider a private case on its merits. Corvin I dealt with by showing him the mate mark. He sat very still for a moment. Then, that is how long? 6 weeks. You've had a Dravenmere hostage in your keep with an active mate mark for 6 weeks, and you didn't. She is not a hostage. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, I said, and I waited because she is not a trophy and she is not a strategic piece, and I did not intend to handle something this significant as though it were a border agreement to be executed on a timeline. I paused. She told me she had no intention of using the bond as leverage. I believed her. I still believe her. The midwinter rite is in 2 weeks and both of us are going into it with clear eyes, and if you have concerns about the succession, I suggest you update the relevant documents. Corvin, who is the most practical person I know, looked at the warmth at my wrist for a moment and said, "Both parties choosing it consciously." "Both parties." "Then," he said, "I'll have the right documents prepared." The question of her king's delegation arrived the following week in the form of a formal message. Dravenmere would be sending a small diplomatic contingent to observe the midwinter rite, as the subject of the rite involved a Dravenmere citizen of military rank, and protocol required representation. Protocol in this case was a fiction. Her king was sending witnesses, because he could not decide if this was a disaster or an opportunity, and wanted to see which it was before committing. I sent back a reply welcoming the contingent and left the rest to what was going to happen. Myra's reaction when I told her was the look she gets when she has been expecting a difficulty and is mildly satisfied to see it arrive on schedule. "He'll send Harvin," she said. "My king's first voice. He'll be polite and he'll be watching everything." "Good," I said. "I want him to watch." She looked at me. "You want Dravenmere to see this?" "I want both courts to see this," I said. "That was always going to be the case. The question is whether it reads as a hostage situation resolved diplomatically, or as something else. And what is it actually?" I looked at the warmth at my wrist, which had in the last week become less a warmth and more a kind of deep, settled conviction. "It is the most significant thing that has happened in this kingdom in 11 years, I said, "and I intend to treat it accordingly." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was carefully level, "And if I in the right if I choose it clearly." "Then you are my fated mate," I said. "Not a diplomatic guest, not a shame gift, not a Dravenmere citizen on loan. My mate with all the standing and protection that carries in this kingdom, and everything else is secondary." The gray eyes studied me. "The war," I said, "has been going for 11 years on momentum and inherited grievance. My father started it over a grazing dispute on the eastern lowlands. Do you know what the eastern lowlands are worth?" "I read the economic records," she said dryly. "Then you know they are worth considerably less than 454 wolves." She looked at the window, then back at me. "He won't end it because of a mate bond, even a genuine one. He'll call it coercion. He'll say I was pressured." "I know," I said. "The war is a separate problem that will take separate time. But I am not delaying this because of how it looks to a king who sent you here as an insult and got something he didn't plan for. I paused. Unless you are telling me to. She held my gaze for a long moment. I am not telling you to. Then we proceed. The midwinter rite in Arivast is held on the longest night of the year in the Great Hall, with the hall's 100 lanterns lit and the pack assembled, and the old ceremony stones uncovered from their alcoves on the north wall, quartz slabs from the founding era, which go warm when the bond confirms. It is not a complicated rite. Both parties stand before the pack. Both speak the choosing the oldest form simply. I see you. I choose you, freely and knowing, and the mark either confirms or it does not. And if it does, the stones go warm, and the whole pack knows without being told. What made this rite unusual? The south wall of the great hall had been cleared for the Dravenmere contingent. Harvin, her king's first voice, a tall man with the careful eyes of someone paid to notice things, had arrived that morning with 4 others, and had spent the day being courted with Arivast hospitality, with the quiet, professional wariness of a person who suspected the hospitality was deliberate. It was. I have been governing long enough to know that the meal before the difficulty matters. My own pack-hold alphas were in the upper tiers. The 2 I had invited, and, unexpectedly, the 3rd, who had apparently revised her position on her own, which I noted with some satisfaction. Roth and Edwin were in the first rank. Sella, who had become Myra's unlikely ally over the archive months, and had not bothered to hide it after the 3rd week, stood near the east pillar with an expression of someone who is trying not to appear invested and is not succeeding. Corvin had the right documents in order. Wren was at my left heel. Myra came in from the south entrance, not the formal west entrance, which would have staged it as a procession. She had suggested the south entrance herself, quietly, the evening before, and I had agreed because she was right that the west entrance would have made it look like a display. She came in from the south in Arivast colors. She had not asked for them, and I had not offered them. She had found, somehow, a deep amber wool that was close enough to make the point without being a declaration, which was exactly correct, which was, I had noticed, exactly the kind of thing she did. And she walked the length of the hall with the same composure she had walked in through the south gate with 6 weeks ago, and Wren walked out 2 steps to meet her and fell in at her right side, and the hall went still the way the courtyard had gone still the day she arrived. I heard Harvin, from his place at the south wall, make a sound of someone recalculating. She came to a stop across the ceremony stones from me. The quartz was cool and pale in the lantern light, waiting. She met my eyes. The look in them was the one I had been working to correctly identify since the morning she arrived, and I had it now. It was the look of someone who had opened a door they hadn't expected to find, and having looked at what was on the other side, had made a clear decision to walk through. I spoke first. I see you. The hall was so quiet I could feel it. I choose you, I said, freely and knowing. She held my gaze, and then in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall without her having raised it, clear and perfectly level and entirely without performance, I see you. I choose you, freely and knowing. The marks woke on both wrists at the same instant. It was not subtle. The mate mark in full bloom is not. It is a warm gold, darker than lantern light, that surfaces along the inner wrist and runs 2 inches toward the pulse, and in the dark of the hall it is visible from the upper tiers. I heard the sound that moved through the pack, not a gasp, something deeper than that, the sound of 300 wolves registering something that is true on a level below language. The ceremony stones went warm under our hands. From the south wall, complete silence. Harvin's face was very still and very careful and deeply focused, the face of a man who came to observe a diplomatic chess move and is now in the presence of something that is not chess. Wren, at her side, lowered his head and closed his eyes. I stepped across the ceremony stones and took her left hand in my right one, the mark to the mark, which is the old confirmation, the one that makes it final, and she did not pull back, and the warmth that went through both of us at the contact was warm enough that I felt it in my back teeth. She said very quietly just to me, "Your wolf is crying." I looked. Ren was not crying. He is a wolf. He does not have the apparatus, but his eyes were wet in the way of very old animals in very good moments, and his tail was moving slowly. "He's been waiting 14 years for this," I said. "So have I," she said, "and I didn't even know. The right is the right. What comes after it is the rest." Harvin requested a private audience with me the following morning. Formal, correct, with exactly the amount of diplomatic courtesy that signals the conversation is serious. I gave him an hour in my council room with Corvin and Edwin present and let him make his observations, which were careful and intelligent, and then I laid out, without excess, the terms that Aravost was prepared to offer toward a formal end to the Cold War. The Ridge returned to joint administration. The economic corridors reopened on the pre-war agreements, a mutual withdrawal from 3 contested border points, and offered last, because it was the most significant and I wanted the framework established before he got to it, a permanent diplomatic mission in both courts. He listened with the stillness of someone processing a large amount of information at speed. Then, "This is a significant offer." "The situation is a significant one," I said. "Your king sent me someone I did not expect. I intend to honor that in every direction." Harvin looked at Corvin, who gave him nothing, and back at me. "The bond is confirmed," I said, "by the ceremony stones before both courts with 300 witnesses. It is not a diplomatic arrangement. It is not a calculated positioning. She is my fated mate, and I would have told your king so in a formal letter whether it served Aravost strategically or not." I paused. "It does, as it happens, serve Aravost strategically, but that is not why it's true." He took a breath that was not quite a sigh. "He will need time." "He can have time," I said. "Myra is not waiting on his approval, but if his interests are what I understand them to be, and I have read your economic records for 11 years, so I think they are, peace is better for Dravenmere than the war has been." Another pause, then quietly, with what I thought was a degree of genuine feeling beneath the diplomat, "She is well." "She is," I said. "She has spent 6 weeks reading my Ridge records and teaching my border wolves to track crosswind and identifying 3 inefficiencies in my trade ministry that I have since corrected. She is considerably better than the situation she arrived in warranted." Harvin's expression shifted into something very slightly warm. "She always was," he said, "better than the situation warranted. Her father was the best border captain we ever had." "I know," I said. "I've read his records too. He taught her well." The audience ended with a handshake. It did not end the war. That required 6 more months and 4 more formal sessions, and a treaty document that Corvin and his counterpart on the Dravenmere side produced in 3 drafts before both parties were satisfied. But it was the beginning of the end, which is the only kind of beginning that matters with something that has been running 11 years on inheritance and grievance. 3 days after the right, I found her in the archive room again. Not the Ridge records, she had finished those in the first 3 weeks. She had the founding-era trade agreements out, the ones that predated the war by 60 years, and she was reading them with the particular focus I had come to recognize as the sign that she had found something useful. I sat across the table from her. She did not look up immediately, which I had also come to recognize as the sign that she was at the end of a thought and wanted to finish it before she lost the thread. After a moment she said, without looking up, "The Eastern Lowlands." "Yes." The pre-war agreement had a joint grazing provision that was never formally voided. It was just ignored for 40 years. "I know," I said. "Corvin found it in the 2nd year of my rule, and we didn't pursue it because the political capital required outweighed the land value." She looked up. "But it means the war never had a legal foundation. Your father's claim was built on a provision that was already answered. Yes. She looked at me with the gray eyes that I now knew well enough to read, and what they held was not triumph and not vindication. It was the same thing they had held over the ridge map on the 6th day. The look of someone who wants to understand what actually happened, so that the same thing doesn't happen again. Then it could end cleanly, she said. Not a negotiated compromise. A restoration of the existing agreement which was never voided, which both sides can claim is simply resuming what was interrupted. Which saves everyone the appearance of having lost, I said. Yes, she paused. Was that always the sticking point? Dravenmir's sticking point was appearance. Ours was the ridge. If I give them the appearance of restoration rather than defeat, and they give me joint administration of the ridge in the framework of the pre-existing provision, both courts can go home with something they can describe as a win. She looked at the document. Then, I did not come here to solve your war. No, I said. You came here because your king sent you as an insult. And then you sat in my archive room and read everything you could find because that is what you do when you are put somewhere you didn't choose. You try to understand it properly. A pause. Is that what I do? It is what I have watched you do for 6 weeks, I said. You arrived in a bad situation and you did not perform your way through it, and you did not manage it strategically. You just tried to understand it honestly. She was quiet. The morning light came through the archive windows, the particular low winter light of Aravost in deep season, pale amber on the sandstone, and the warmth at both our wrists was a settled, certain thing now, past the early uncertainty, present the way breathing is present. She said, my father told me once that the only way out of a bad situation was through the truth of it. That most bad situations persisted, because everyone involved had agreed to talk around the real thing. He was right, I said, in my experience. In mine too, she paused. He would have liked you. I felt something shift in my chest quietly, without drama, the way the important things tend to move. Tell me about him, I said. And she did, there in the archive room in the winter morning light. And Wren lay under the table between us, and Kale was somewhere in the east courtyard in a sunbeam. And the trade agreements from 60 years ago were spread between us with the answer to 11 years of war written in faded ink. And the warmth at my wrist was not a question anymore. The treaty was signed in the first week of spring, in a neutral hall on the border road, with Corvin and Harvin standing across a table they had both spent 4 months finding the right shape for. I signed for Aravost. Dravenmir's king sent his chancellor, not Harvin, which I had anticipated, because he was still deciding how to publicly frame the thing, and the chancellor signed with the careful speed of someone executing an instruction, and the document was witnessed and sealed, and it was done. Myra was not in the neutral hall. She had not come to the border meeting, her choice, made quietly when I had mentioned it, without explanation except that she thought it was cleaner if she wasn't part of the official record of the signing. I understood. There are situations where a presence makes something look political that should look like law, and this was one. She was in the east courtyard when I rode back in, sitting on the low wall with old Kale's head on her knee in the last of the afternoon light. Bryn was somewhere nearby. I could hear the young wolf in the passage, probably still tracking crosswind. I dismounted and came across the courtyard, and she looked up with the gray eyes that I now knew the way you know the layout of your own keep in the dark, by the particular warmth of each room. She said, "It's done." "It's done," I said. A pause and I said, sitting down beside her, both courts can describe it as a restoration of a pre-existing agreement that was interrupted, which means no one has to say they lost, which means it might actually hold. Kale's tail moved. Bryn came around the passage corner, found us, and settled at Myra's other side with the focused satisfaction of a wolf who has decided a situation is correct. She said, 40 years of war that had no legal foundation and 11 years of inherited grievance, settled because someone actually read the archive documents. The documents were always there, I said. No one wanted to read them honestly. She was quiet for a moment. The amber light of late afternoon was warm on the sandstone walls, and the lanterns would be coming on soon, and the court that had watched a soldier's daughter walk through the South Gate 6 months ago as something to be categorized and handled was quiet and ordinary in the way of a place that has been recalibrated. She said, looking at the warmth at her wrist, "He still hasn't sent me a formal acknowledgement, my king." "I know. He will eventually. He'll couch it as political pragmatism." "I expect so." She turned her hand over the left one and looked at the mark for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Are you going to mind, when he does, the phrasing?" "I am going to mind," I said, "in exactly the amount that matters to me personally and none of the amount that affects anything important." The ghost of the dry humor crossed her face. "That's a very carefully calibrated answer." "It is the honest one," I said. "I learned from a border captain's daughter that talking around the real thing is how situations persist." She turned back to the courtyard. Cale made the sound of deep contentment. The first of the lanterns came on in the passage above, the old working, reliable as ever. I put my right hand over her left one, the mark to the warm skin, and she did not move away. And the warmth between us was not the warmth of a question and not the warmth of something being decided. It was just settled. The way the treaty was settled, the way the long war was settled, the way the door finally rests in its frame when someone has the sense to put it on level ground. My wolf had known it the morning she walked in through the south gate. The rest of us had taken 6 months to catch up. Wren, in the den below, made a sound that I felt more than heard, low and content. The sound of an old wolf who has been patient for 14 years and has no complaints about how it ended.